The story of Sleeping Beauty that you know is a lie. It isn't a romance about true love's kiss. It is a sanitized cover-up of a crime scene. You've been raised on the comfortable version. A beautiful princess falls under a curse, sleeps for 100 years, and is gently awakened by a noble prince. It is the ultimate symbol of romantic salvation. It's magical. It's pure. And it is completely false. Because in the earliest versions of this tale, there was no consent, there was no romance, and there was certainly no kiss. There was only a defenseless woman in a tower, and a man who took exactly what he wanted. The version of the story we feed our children today is actually a centuries-old act of censorship. It is a fabrication designed to hide a narrative so dark involving violation, cannibalism, and betrayal that it makes modern horror movies look tame. The prince wasn't a savior. He was a predator. And the princess didn't wake up because of a magical kiss. She woke up because of the biological consequences of the assault she endured while unconscious. To find the real Sleeping Beauty, we have to strip away the ball gowns and the singing birds. We have to go back to 14th century France, before the censors scrubbed the blood from the pages, to see exactly what they were trying to hide. To understand the truth, we must abandon the sanitized nursery of the Victorian era and travel back to the very beginning, where the tale first took shape in the brutal, deeply strange world of medieval Europe. The origin point of Sleeping Beauty lies in medieval France, somewhere between 1330 and 1344, buried within a massive, anonymous courtly romance called Perceforest. You have to picture the scene. We are in the great, draughty halls of French nobility, a world illuminated by flickering torchlight, where life was short, violence was casual, and morality was a rigid, suffocating code. This was the era of courtly romance, a genre that modern readers often misunderstand as merely stories of knights fighting dragons for damsels. But to the medieval mind, these were complex moral allegories where the boundaries between the literal and the metaphorical were almost non-existent. In the world of Perceforest, readers expected abstract concepts to walk onto the page as casual as any mortal character. Knights didn't just struggle internally with honor or courage. They swore oaths to them as if they were living kings. In these stories, reason wasn't just an idea in someone's head. She was a stern woman in flowing robes who might physically grab a knight by the shoulder to warn him of spiritual danger. Discretion might appear as a matron blocking a doorway. And, most dangerously, Venus, the ancient goddess of desire, repurposed for a Christianized world as the embodiment of carnal lust manifested as a beautiful, irresistible tempter whose whispers overruled all human judgment. It is into this bizarre, allegorical landscape that our proto-Sleeping Beauty is born. In this earliest version, the princess is named Zelandine, and the setup, at least initially, seems sickeningly familiar. Zelandine falls into an enchanted, death-like sleep after pricking her finger not on a spindle, but on a flax splinter beneath her fingernail. She is taken to a high tower, laid out in state, a beautiful, silent effigy. And there she waits. Eventually, a knight named Troilus, our supposed prince, finds his way into the tower. He discovers Zelandine, unconscious, defenseless, and radiantly beautiful. And it is here, in this silent room, that the story takes the turn that history has tried so hard to bury. Troilus is overcome by desire, but he is a knight, bound by codes of chivalry. He knows that what he is contemplating is a profound evil, and this internal conflict is dramatized on the page in the only way the medieval mind knew how, through allegory. While Troilus stands over the sleeping girl, two figures materialize before him, not metaphors, but physical presences blocking his path. On one side stands reason, warning him explicitly that violating a woman without her permission, especially while she is incapable of resistance, marks a man as the lowest kind of criminal, a beast without honor. For the medieval audience, this wasn't subtle symbolism. This was the force of moral order itself, telling Troilus to stop. But then Venus appears, radiant, terrible, the supreme divine authority on matters of the flesh. She doesn't suggest. She doesn't tempt. She commands. She tells Troilus to lie with the unconscious princess, framing the assault not just as permissible, but as a divine mandate of courtly love. And in the moral framework of medieval romance, when a god gives a direct order, mortals obey. The audience reading this in the 14th century would have understood this moment as a complex tragedy, Troilus's moral damnation, but also his inescapable excuse. He is terrified of offending the goddess of love. So he obeys. He violates Zelendine while she sleeps. And then he leaves. The princess does not wake from this violation with a gasp of realization. There is no magical kiss that breaks the spell. The horror of the original tale is that Zelendine remains unconscious, a passive object, long after her assailant has departed. She remains in her death-like state for 9 more months. Her body, though asleep, continues to function biologically, carrying the consequences of Troilus's assault. She grows heavy with child, entirely unaware of her condition. In the silence of that tower, she goes into labor while still in a coma. She delivers a child she never knew she conceived, all without ever regaining consciousness. The awakening, when it finally comes, is not romantic, it is practical and grotesque. The infant, searching desperately for nourishment, begins to suckle on his mother's finger instead of her breast. In doing so, the child accidentally draws out the cursed flax splinter from beneath her nail. Zelendine wakes up not to the loving gaze of a future husband, but to the shocking reality of motherhood. She finds an infant at her breast, and her body irrevocably changed, with absolutely no memory of how any of it happened. The text tells us she mourns. She recognizes the non-consensual act she endured, even as the strange logic of the story eventually expects her to love the man who committed it when he finally returns. It is a grim, unsettling origin. It establishes the core theme that later versions would try to mask, that this is a story about the theft of autonomy. But incredibly, this 14th century French version wasn't even the darkest the story would get. It was just the beginning. 300 years later, the tale would travel to Italy, where it would fall into the hands of a storyteller who decided that mere violation wasn't horrifying enough. He needed to add an element so repulsive it would make the original seem almost gentle by comparison. If the French Persephorist provided the blueprint for violation, it was the Italians who turned it into a nightmare. In 1634, a poet named Giambattista Basile published what would become the direct ancestor of our modern tale. But to understand why his version is so uniquely disturbing, you have to understand the world he lived in. Forget the chivalric code of the French knights. We are now in the glittering, decadent courts of 17th century Naples. This was a city of extremes, filth and gold, piety and sin, where nobles gathered not for polite conversation, but for entertainment that pushed every conceivable boundary. Basile himself was a courtier and a soldier who had travelled from Venice to Mantua, collecting the darkest, most grotesque tales from the slums and taverns of Italy. His collection, the Pentamerone, or the Tale of Tales, was written in a thick Neapolitan dialect, specifically for aristocrats who prided themselves on their sophistication and their ability to stomach the unseemly. These weren't bedtime stories for children. They were performance pieces for banquets where wine flowed freely and the nobility competed to show how unshockable they were. They wanted stories that featured mutilation, incest, and bodily functions, all wrapped in Baroque language so ornate it turned horror into art. The nobles would laugh at the crude humor, gasp at the violence, and then debate the moral implications between courses of roasted peacock. It was for this audience, people who watched public executions for sport, that Basile wrote Sun, Moon, and Thalia. In this version, the setup is similar. The flax splinter, the prophecy, the sleep. But the prince here, a king on a hunting expedition, is stripped of even the pretense of hesitation. When he climbs into the abandoned palace and finds the unconscious Thalia, Basile doesn't hide behind the metaphors of goddesses or divine commands. The king, overcome with lust for the sleeping woman, simply takes her. The original Italian text is chillingly explicit in its brevity. He plucks from her the fruits of love. And then he leaves. He returns to his own kingdom, his own life, and his own wife, as if nothing happened. Talia remains unconscious through the assault, through 9 months of pregnancy, and through the agony of childbirth. She delivers twins while still in her death-like sleep. The babies, whom she never names but who become known as Sun and Moon, survive only by chance. One day, searching for milk, one of the infants sucks on her finger instead of her breast, drawing out the cursed splinter. Talia wakes up. But unlike the Disney version where the kingdom rejoices, Talia wakes up to a lonely, confused reality, holding 2 children she doesn't remember bearing, in a castle that is essentially a tomb. When the king finally decides to return, not to save her, but simply because he remembered his adventure and wanted to indulge himself again, he finds her awake. Basile tells us he is thrilled, not ashamed, not apologetic. Thrilled. He engages in a relationship with her, continuing to visit her in secret. But here is where the story truly diverges from the fairy tale, you know. In the modern version, the waking is the end. In Basile's version, the waking is merely the prelude to the true horror. The king is married, and his wife, the queen, is not the passive villain of a Disney movie. She is a woman scorned in a brutal, patriarchal society. When she eventually discovers her husband's infidelity, when she learns about the secret family hidden in the woods, she doesn't just get angry. She orchestrates a revenge so monstrous it defies comprehension. She doesn't want to banish Talia. She wants to consume her legacy. The queen sends a forged message to bring the children, Sun and Moon, to the palace. She then orders the royal cook to slaughter the infants. But she doesn't stop at murder. She orders the cook to chop them up, make them into a stew, and serve them to the king for dinner. She wants her husband to unknowingly consume his own offspring. This plot point, cannibalism within the family, isn't unique to Basile's imagination. It is a recurring nightmare that echoes through European folklore like a collective scream. It calls back to the ancient Greek myth of Thyestes, who unknowingly ate his own sons at a feast prepared by his brother. It echoes the story of Procne, who murdered her son, boiled him, and served him to her husband Tereus to punish him for raping her sister. These stories of parents consuming their children appear again and again, from ancient Greece to medieval England, always serving as the nuclear option of folklore. It represents the ultimate violation of natural order, the point where a human becomes a monster, and the sacred bond between parent and child is perverted into sustenance. In Basile's telling, the cook cannot bring himself to slaughter the beautiful infants. He hides the twins with his wife and kills 2 lambs instead, dressing the meat in a thick, rich sauce to hide the taste. But the queen doesn't know about the substitution. The dinner scene that follows is a masterclass in dramatic irony and psychological horror. The king eats the stew with gusto, praising the tenderness of the meat. And as her husband eats what she believes are his own children, the queen watches with a grim satisfaction. She whispers under her breath, a taunt that becomes a chant. Eat, eat. You are eating of your own. The king, oblivious, simply replies, I know, for I provided the meat. He thinks she is talking about his royal hunting grounds. She knows she is talking about his flesh and blood. For Basile's audience, this moment was the peak of entertainment, the tension between the gruesome reality and the king's ignorance. The story eventually resolves with the king discovering the plot, burning his wife alive and marrying Talia. But the damage is done. The image of that dinner, the father feasting while the mother chants, is the stain that cannot be washed out. Yet, even this wasn't the end of the story's evolution. As the 17th century bled into the 18th, and the centre of cultural gravity shifted from the raucous Italian courts to the refined salons of Paris, this version became a liability. The raw, unfiltered horror of Basile was too much for the new era of civilized storytelling. The story needed a mask. It needed a way to keep the structure but remove the revulsion. It needed a lie that was beautiful enough to hide the truth forever. And that is where the French stepped in to invent the most famous cover-up in literary history. When Charles Perrault adapted the tale for the French court in 1697, he was operating in a world that was allergic to the crude reality of Basile's Italy. Picture Versailles under Louis XIV, the Sun King. Every corridor gleamed with gold, and every conversation was a minefield of etiquette. But more importantly, This was the era of the salons. Parisian culture was being reshaped by powerful, intellectual women, the precieuses who gathered in private drawing rooms to debate philosophy, literature, and the politics of love. These women, like Madame de Sévigné and Madame de Lafayette, were actively challenging the brutal, patriarchal norms of the past. They were writing novels that championed tender love and female agency. They were the cultural gatekeepers of the moment. Perrault, a member of the Académie Française and a savvy courtier, knew exactly who his audience was. He couldn't walk into a salon filled with educated women and tell a story about a king who rapes a sleeping woman, leaves her pregnant, and then is welcomed back as a hero. It wasn't just impolite, it was culturally radioactive. So, Perrault performed a surgical intervention on the story. He made a calculated decision to save the narrative structure by destroying its dark heart. He removed the assault entirely. The king became a prince, younger, unmarried, more palatable. The fruits of love plucked from an unconscious body vanished. But this created a massive plot hole. In the original versions, the biological consequence of the violation, the birth of the children, was the mechanic that woke the princess up. The baby sucked the splinter out. Without the assault, and without the pregnancy, there was no way for the princess to wake up. Perrault had to invent a new trigger. He had to create a mechanism that was intimate enough to suggest a connection, but chaste enough for the French court. And so, he invented the kiss. You have to understand what's happening here. The kiss that you know, the one Disney immortalized, the one parents tell their children is the symbol of true love, isn't a romantic tradition dating back to antiquity. It is a narrative patch. It is a substitution designed specifically to erase a crime. The violence that drove the original plot vanished, replaced by a moment so chaste it barely qualified as contact. The prince kneels, he admires her, and in Perrault's original text he doesn't even explicitly kiss her on the lips. He trembles, approaches, and the spell breaks simply because the time had come. But Perrault didn't sanitize everything. Remarkably, while he scrubbed the sexual violence from the first half of the story, he kept the cannibalistic nightmare of the second half. In his version, La Belle au Bois dormant, the prince marries the awakened princess in secret. Why? Because his mother is an ogress. Perrault shifted the villainy from the husband to the mother-in-law, a move that protected the image of the king while preserving the horror the audience craved. When the prince, now king, goes off to war, his ogress mother gives into her insatiable hunger for raw meat. She orders the cook to prepare her daughter-in-law and her two grandchildren, named Jour Day and Aurore Dawn, for her dinner. Perrault repeats the compassionate cook motif. The cook substitutes animals for the humans. But the climax is even more metal than Basile's. When the ogress discovers she's been eating livestock instead of her grandchildren, she prepares a massive copper vat in the courtyard. She fills it with vipers, toads, dragons, and venomous serpents. She intends to throw the young queen and her children into this writhing mass of poisonous death. The king returns just in the nick of time. The ogress, realizing she has been caught, throws herself into the vat, being devoured by the very monsters she summoned. Perrault's version was a hybrid, sanitized in the bedroom, but still bloody in the kitchen. It was a bridge between the old horror and the new morality. But the story's transformation wasn't finished. A century later, two brothers in Germany would strip it down even further, not for courtly politics, but to forge the identity of a nation. Enter the brothers Grimm in 1812. Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm weren't just storytellers. They were literary archivists with a political agenda. Germany didn't exist as a unified country yet. It was a fractured patchwork of kingdoms and duchies. The brothers believed that the soul of the German people lay hidden in their folklore, in the stories told by peasants and grandmothers. They wanted to prove that a distinct, pure German culture existed, one that was superior to the corrupt French influence. But their project required purity. The brothers, devout Protestants influenced by the moral strictness of the Biedermeier era, couldn't present a national epic filled with cannibalism and secret marriages. They needed stories that taught obedience, order, and family values. Over 7 editions of their children's and household tales, they systematically cleaned their stories. They removed sexual references, softened the violence, and added Christian morality where none had existed before. For Sleeping Beauty, which they called Little Briar Rose, Dawn Roshan, they didn't just edit the text. They amputated the story. They looked at the second half, the secret marriage, the ogress mother-in-law, the attempted infanticide, the vat of vipers, and they cut it all. Gone. In the Grimm version, the story ends exactly where modern audiences expect it to end, with the kiss, the awakening, and the wedding. The happily ever after wasn't the natural conclusion of the tale. It was an artificial stopping point created by two German scholars who felt the rest of the story was too messy for the nursery. By cutting the story in half, the Grimms fundamentally changed its meaning. The original tales were sagas about survival, about a woman who endures violation, wakes up to a hostile world, navigates a dangerous marriage, and protects her children from a murderous matriarch. It was a story about resilience in the face of horror. The Grimm version is a story about passivity. The princess does nothing. She pricks her finger, she sleeps, she is looked at, she is kissed, and she is married. She has no agency, no voice, and no struggle. She is merely a prize waiting to be claimed. This is the version that Disney adapted. This is the version that conquered the world. We traded the complex, bloody, traumatizing truth of the original for a perfect, sterile loop of aesthetic beauty. But even the most thorough sanitization leaves scars. You can scrub the blood from the floorboards, but you can't change the architecture of the house. The dark symbolism of the original tale remains encoded in even the most innocent versions, hidden in plain sight for those who know how to read the signs. The spindle, the blood, the thorns, they are all artifacts of the original trauma. Waiting to be decoded, the brothers Grimm may have amputated the cannibalism, and Perrault may have masked the rape, but they couldn't scrub everything. Stories are like crime scenes. Even after the bodies are moved and the floor is bleached, the microscopic evidence remains. In folklore, this evidence survives as symbols, objects, and actions that carry the weight of the original meaning long after the plot has been changed. When you strip away the Disney Technicolor, the iconography of Sleeping Beauty reveals itself as a roadmap of female trauma and the suppression of agency. The dark symbolism remains encoded in even the most sanitized versions, hidden in plain sight for those who know how to read the signs. And it all begins with the spindle. To the modern viewer, the spinning wheel is just a quaint prop, a dusty antique that drives the plot. But to a medieval or early modern audience, the spindle carried a heavy, double-edged significance. First, consider the economics. For centuries, spinning was the universal occupation of women. It was one of the very few professions that allowed a woman to earn her own money, independent of a father or a husband. The legal term for an unmarried woman, spinster, wasn't originally an insult. It was a job description. It meant a woman who could sustain herself. So, look at the curse again. The king, in a desperate bid to protect his daughter, bans all spindles from the kingdom. He doesn't just ban a sharp object, he systematically removes the tool of female industry. He creates a world where his daughter cannot work, cannot produce, and cannot be independent. He tries to enforce a state of permanent, passive safety, but the prophecy is inevitable. The moment the princess touches the spindle, the moment she reaches for the tool of independence, or perhaps the moment she reaches for knowledge that has been forbidden to her, she is punished. And the punishment is physical. The symbolism here is not subtle, and it certainly isn't Freudian by accident. The spindle is long, hard, and pointed. The princess pricks her finger. She bleeds. The penetration of the flesh causes a loss of consciousness. In the sanitized version, this is just a magic spell. But in the context of the original Persephorist and Basile versions, the symbolism is a glaring neon sign pointing to the violence that was removed. The spindle represents the inevitable intersection of sexuality and pain in a world where women lack agency. The curse is a warning. The moment a girl transitions into womanhood, represented by the blood on the finger, she becomes vulnerable. She falls from the state of active curiosity into a state of passive victimhood. The spindle acts as the precursor to the assault. It is the narrative device that renders her defenseless. stripping her of her autonomy so that the prince, or the trauma, can enter. But the spindle is only the surface wound. Beneath the blood and the sleep lies an older, deeper rhythm, one that echoes through myth and ritual. The 100-year sleep transforms the princess into something neither alive nor dead. She exists in a liminal space, breathing but unconscious, beautiful but unreachable. This state mirrors an ancient pattern that appears in myths across the world, long predating Sleeping Beauty herself. It is the myth of the stolen season. Think of Persephone from Greek mythology. She is the daughter of Demeter, the harvest goddess. She is picking flowers in a meadow, innocent, distracted, when the earth suddenly splits open. Hades, the lord of the underworld, emerges in his black chariot and drags her down into his realm to be his bride. While Persephone remains trapped below, her mother's grief turns the world to winter. Nothing grows. The grain rots in the soil. The earth itself enters a death-like sleep. Only when Persephone returns does spring arrive. But she is bound to the underworld for part of every year, creating the eternal cycle of death and rebirth. Sleeping Beauty is Persephone in a tower instead of the underworld. Her kingdom is frozen in thorns instead of ice. The princess doesn't just sleep, she acts as a tether for the entire world around her. When she closes her eyes, the castle, the servants, the horses, and even the flies on the wall freeze in place. They are locked in an eternal moment, a stasis that defies time. This isn't sleep, it is death without decay. It is winter without end. When she finally wakes, whether through childbirth in the original or a kiss in the sanitized version, she brings life back to the land. The names of the characters reinforce this solar reading. In Basile's version, her children are sun and moon. In Perrault's version, her daughter is named Aurore, dawn. In the Tchaikovsky ballet, the princess herself is Aurora. She is the light returning after the longest night. But there is a critical, terrifying difference between the myth and the fairy tale. Persephone eventually became the queen of the underworld. She negotiated power within her darkness. Sleeping Beauty has no such arc. She is the object of the season, not the master of it. She is the battlefield on which winter and spring fight, completely unaware that the war is happening on her body. And then there are the thorns. In the later versions of the story, particularly the Grimms, a massive hedge of briars grows around the sleeping castle. In the Disney movie, Maleficent summons them as a weapon. But in the folklore, the thorns are more than just an obstacle course for the hero. They are alive. They are sentient. The legend tells us that many other princes tried to reach the sleeping princess before the 100 years were up. But the hedge didn't just block them, it actively killed them. The thorns would grab them, hold them fast, and they would die a miserable death, their skeletons hanging in the bushes like macabre ornaments. Psychologically, what are we looking at here? If we view the castle as the princess's mind, the thorns represent the violent, impenetrable barriers built around deep trauma. This is the protective self. When a psyche is shattered by an event too terrible to process, like the violation in the original tales, it builds walls. It shuts down. It freezes. It creates a barrier so hostile that no one can get in. The thorns choke the life out of the unworthy, those who try to force a connection before the trauma is resolved or before the time is right. But here is the dark irony of the prince who finally makes it through. In the Grimm version, the prince doesn't hack through the thorns with a sword. He doesn't fight. He arrives simply because the 100 years have expired. The curse is over. The thorns turn into flowers and part for him of their own accord. He isn't a hero. He is just a man with perfect timing. This recontextualizes the romance entirely. The thorns don't protect the princess from violation. They simply ensure that only the fated person can access her. In the dark logic of the original tales, the thorns ensure that she remains preserved, untouched, and ready for the specific man or the specific event that is destined to claim her. The symbols tell the story that the censors tried to hide. The spindle is the punishment for female autonomy. The sleep is the paralysis of trauma. The thorns are the scar tissue that keeps the world out. And the awakening? In the original stories, the awakening wasn't a triumph. It was just the moment the victim realized what had been done to her while she was gone. The sanitization of these symbols reflects something larger than just changing tastes in children's literature. It represents a culture's decision to rebrand trauma as romance. We took a story about a woman surviving the worst violation imaginable, and we turned it into a story about a girl waiting for a boyfriend. But why? Why do we feel the need to tell the lie? The systematic sanitization of Sleeping Beauty reflects something larger than just changing tastes in children's literature. It represents a collective cultural decision about what truths are too dangerous to keep. Each edit, each omission, each substitution was a brick in a wall built to hide the ugly reality of the human experience. The violence became a kiss. The cannibalistic mother became a comic villain, then disappeared entirely. The complex, messy aftermath of trauma was reduced to happily ever after. But the original stories understood something we have forgotten. They knew that life is brutal. They knew that power corrupts, that victims can become perpetrators, and that salvation and violence often wear the same face. These tales weren't meant to comfort children. They were meant to prepare adults for the horror and complexity of existence. The modern Sleeping Beauty offers a beautiful lie, that good and evil are clearly marked, that true love conquers all, and that patience is always rewarded. The original Sleeping Beauty tells a different truth. It tells us that sometimes you wake up to find your life has been stolen, that the people meant to protect you are often the ones who hurt you most, and that survival might mean accepting the unacceptable. The story we tell our children is a deliberate act of forgetting, a cultural amnesia designed to protect innocence. But the dark heart of the tale remains, beating beneath layers of revision and denial. Every time we tell the sanitized version, we participate in the cover-up. We become complicit in erasing the testimony of countless women throughout history who recognized their own stories in the original tale, women who understood exactly what it meant to wake up and find that everything had changed while they slept. The fairy tale, is exactly that. A fairy tale. The real story, the one they've been hiding for centuries, is a horror story. And the most terrifying part is that we've been telling it to children for generations, dressed up in a princess gown and sealed with a kiss. If you want to continue peeling back the layers of history to find the uncomfortable truths hiding beneath your childhood favorites, make sure you are subscribed to the channel. We are going to ruin a lot more fairy tales, and you won't want to miss what comes next.